Hello and welcome back to another talk from Lancashire District Family History Society in this time of lockdown. Today, thanks to a suggestion from those of you who follow our Facebook page, I'm going to talk about a stumbling block that many of us encounter in our family history research. There is nothing more frustrating than ordering up that crucial marriage or birth certificate even, or looking up a parish register and finding a blank space where you expect a father's name to be. It's a pretty clear indicator that you found an illegitimate ancestor. But does that mean you've got to give up your search and accept that this branch of your family tree is completely dead and will never be furthered at all? Absolutely not. No, definitely not. We quite often find that in great literature, writers use illegitimacy as a device to create drama. In chapter 3 of Emma, Jane Austen's Emma, we actually find that Harriet Smith, who Emma tries to marry off during the course of the novel, is introduced with the description that she was the natural daughter of somebody, and somebody had placed her several years back at Mrs. Goddard's school, and somebody had lately raised her from the condition of scholar to that of parlour boarder. Now, natural daughter and natural son are very polite ways of saying that somebody was illegitimate. In other words, Harriet's parents are not married, and some unknown benefactor has paid towards her boarding school fees and has actually paid a little bit extra on top so that she can have a few extra perks which come with the status of parlour boarder, things like her own room instead of sharing a room, that kind of thing. So somebody is looking out for her. Now, matchmaker Emma, the title character, tries to marry Harriet off to all sorts of people, but the older and more sensible Mr. Knightley points out quite rightly that no upper class gentleman will want to marry somebody like Harriet purely because nobody knows who Harriet's father is, and in Jane Austen's time people wanted to know where they fitted into society, and if you were a man, the way you worked that out was based on your profession, or whether you worked, or whether you had a private income, whether you had a title. If you were a woman, it was defined by whether that same thing applied to your father, brother, uncle, whatever, that kind of thing. So, because there is no father figure in Harriet's life, nobody can quite work out where she fits into society, and for that reason, no titled gentleman would ever consider her. At the end of the novel, we actually learn that Harriet's father is a tradesman who is modest enough to want to keep quiet, shall we say, and well off enough that he can quietly, discreetly cover her school fees. All in all, it's probably just as well that Emma's attempt to marry off Harriet to the local vicar didn't work out. He's not a nice vicar particularly, but it doesn't really look good for a vicar to have a wife who's illegitimate. And then, of course, there's that other great mystery in literature that comes with Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Because Mr. Earnshaw claimed that he found Heathcliff in Liverpool. But I've recently come across a really interesting theory about what might really have happened. My source, an online webpage, notes that before Mr. Earnshaw leaves Wuthering Heights, he clearly spells out that he's going to Liverpool. So he's going from Liverpool to Yorkshire on foot, 60 miles there and 60 miles back, and he's going to walk that in 3 days apparently. So he's a 40-something man, he's going to walk 120 miles in 3 days. How? Even the logistics of that don't make sense, so maybe Mr. Earnshaw never went to Liverpool at all. maybe he actually went to see Heathcliff's mother, who lived a little bit closer by and who he knew he'd fathered a child with, and perhaps he'd been having an affair with, and he goes to see her and she's dead and dying, and then he realises that he should do the right thing and bring back his child to Wuthering Heights. It's interesting that actually when you read the book, it's Mrs. Earnshaw that describes her husband as bringing that gypsy brat into the house when they had their own bairns to feed and fend for. What did he mean to do with it, and was he in fact mad? So at this point in time, Emily Bronte hasn't told us that Heathcliff's a gypsy. She's just said that he speaks some gibberish that nobody understands. So I'll leave that for you to decide, but it's an interesting possibility. But what all this boils down to, really, is that social status was important. And if you couldn't tell people who your father was, they couldn't work out where to place you into society. They didn't know if you were an aristocrat, a peasant, or somebody in between. No wonder it's such a popular dramatic device. Great literature is one thing, but in the world of family history, we want to know about real people who came before us. There are lots of ways to hammer home the point that a baby's parents weren't married. You see this very clearly in the birth certificate of my great-grandfather Samuel Rowland. Born in Lincolnshire in 1860, only his mother Sarah is named. And I always assumed that Samuel's dad would remain a mystery, until I stumbled across an extract from a newspaper published just after Samuel's 4th birthday. That little snippet from the Stamford Mercury is the only evidence I've got of who my great-great-grandfather was, who Samuel Rowland's father was. And from what I can gather, this John Ashwell emigrates to Michigan in the States, and Sarah Rowland marries somebody else. So when her little boy Samuel got married, he actually named his stepfather as his father, even though I've now found quite compelling evidence that his stepdad wasn't his dad at all. He just saw him as his dad. But in the example I used there, we had a birth certificate to work with. So the question is, how do you identify illegitimate ancestors in the time before birth, death and marriage certificates were introduced? Your best bet is probably actually to look at parish records, and they're really interesting because there are all sorts of ways that a parish clerk might use to describe a child whose parents were not married. Some are polite, some are not polite, to be honest. At St Michael's Church in Orton, on the 7th of February 1582-83, we've got Hugh Barker, who's said to be the son of Richard Ledbetter and Marjorie Barker. Different surnames for the parents indicate illegitimacy. 28th of February 1607-08, Robert Gerard, quite clearly described as the bastard son of Joshua Gerard. No questions about that. The 8th of June 1608, Robert Latham, the base son of Thomas Gore and Mary Latham. And then if we turn to St Oswald's, the Catholic chapel at Ormskirk, we have got a record for Helen Spuria. Spurious is false, also used as illegitimate. Mother Alice Howard, father not told. But then a note that says, married afterwards to the child's father MacDonald, and indeed I was able to confirm that. On the 27th of November 1765, we find Angus MacDonald, a sailor from Liverpool, getting married to Alice Howard, a spinster from Horton, at St Michael's, the parish church. Now, One thing to bear in mind, of course, in all these cases is that a female cannot become pregnant by herself. But from the tone of the following record, I think the vicar or clerk of St Andrew's at Maghull was getting a little bit tired of seeing this lady turn up at the font with a baby in her arms. I don't quite know whether Anne Berry ever saw this record or whether she could even read, but I think it speaks volumes. And finally, there is a lovely description to be found at Brindle, which is about 12 miles from Ormskirk. On the 19th of February 1726, Mary Preston of Withnall has her baby Job baptised. The parish registers just call it a chance child, which is a bit different and quite sweet, I think. Baptism records, as useful as they are not the only ways to research your illegitimate ancestors. So let's have a look at what other options are out there. DNA testing is the big thing in family history at the moment, but of course in the 18th century, even into the 20th century, there was no DNA testing, no way of proving paternity in a scientific sense. But it was in the interest of the parish, certainly economically, for the mother, if she lived in whichever parish, to identify the father somehow, because he, in their eyes, was responsible for the birth of the child as much as she was, and therefore he should be obliged to pay towards its upkeep. And otherwise, of course, you realise that if the mother died before the child was old enough to work or be apprenticed or become a servant, so we're probably talking maybe 9 or 10 years old, old enough to be useful basically, the parish officials were going to have to pay to feed and clothe and house that child. And plus also they might have to cover the midwife's fee at the birth if the mother couldn't afford to pay for it. And of course they don't want any unnecessary expenses of that kind. And it is said that women were often pressured to name the child, even to the point where her attendants would withhold the alcohol or whatever was on hand during labour to dull the pain of childbirth, until she caved in and told them. Which is really cruel actually, but probably reflective of how keen the parish were to save themselves a bit of money. So assuming that they got the father's name, they could then summon him to court to pay for a paternity case, effectively, which would then be heard, and sometimes a friend or relation would actually pay out a sum of money, which is known as a recognizance, as a promise that the father would turn up for the hearing. So it then becomes in the interest of this friend or relative that the father does show up in court, because if not, that friend or relative is going to have to forfeit the money. It was sometimes as much as £20, a lot of money in the 18th century, as a sort of assurance that the father would appear in court. We, being the Ormskirk and District Family History Society, is actually quite interesting to see where reports about cases of illegitimacy from our area do come up in the newspapers. Now Manchester, for instance, is nowhere near Ormskirk, and yet in the 18th century it was exploding to become this massive industrial city, major city in the northwest of England. So it's probably not really surprising that by the 1780s the newspaper, the Manchester Mercury, had begun to report all sorts of news from all over Lancashire, including the names and addresses of people involved in these recognizances for paternity cases, whether they were the guarantor or the accused, and the reason that they had to go to court in the first place. So let's have a look at some examples. Now, all of those cases relate to illegitimate children and their alleged fathers, but they don't actually give the children's names, which is something that you're obviously going to want to know if you're trying to match up those records with a child that's in your family. To establish the name of the child, your best bet is simply to search for baptisms using the mother's maiden name. That's generally the better way to research an illegitimate child. As we can see here, it took 2 years for Frances Snape to get maintenance for her daughter Elizabeth. So they weren't always instant, these paternity cases. They did take some time to get to court. One useful tool that you might want to try is the Lancashire Archives online catalogue, which is totally free to view and includes indexes of the quarter sessions records with the references where these cases were heard. We may not be able to go to the archives at the moment, but we can at least check online using the catalogue to see whether there are any interesting records relating to cases of illegitimacy, perhaps in your family, perhaps just in the general wider area. And in the case of Frances Snape, Richard Wilcock and their daughter Elizabeth, we find 2 interesting records. An order nisi is one that only takes effect when certain conditions are met. So I wonder what they were in the case of Richard and Frances. I wonder, perhaps did he have a very sporadic income? Maybe he arranged some kind of agreement where he would only pay maintenance if he earned more than 5 or 10 or 15 shillings a week, something like that. Or maybe the order only applied as long as Frances remained unmarried, on the theory that if she had a husband, he would support her and any children that she had, whether or not they were his. And then when you look at some of the other names that came up in the Manchester Mercury there, particularly you see the cases of Phoebe Maudsley and Anne Sefton took years to get sorted out. So the newspaper's publication date is only really the vaguest of clues as to when the baby might have been born. Some mothers spent several years trying to get the fathers to pay maintenance and contribute towards the upkeep of their children, so the only thing you can be fairly sure about with newspapers is that the child had been born at the time when the case is mentioned in the paper, and presumably they had lived long enough that the mother was still able to pursue the case and get some money. Logic tells you that if the child has died, then she can't claim maintenance money for a child that no longer exists. So staying in our part of the world, let us look at somebody a bit more upper class, because illegitimacy can be found across all social classes. Many people, for instance, describe Charles Scarisbrick of Scarisbrick Hall as an eccentric, a recluse, a bit of an oddity. One member of our society advises me that amongst the other many interesting things that he did, he had 3 children with his mistress Mary Ann Braithwaite. He invested in art and property and all sorts of other commodities. He had a whole huge expanse of land in Southport, as I understand it, also that his children could have some sort of inheritance, but he didn't do the most obvious thing, which was simply to marry Mary Ann and legitimise the children. So when Charles died, it wasn't his eldest son Charles who inherited Scarisbrick Hall, but in fact the late Charles's sister Anne. And about 1,000 tenants celebrated her arrival at Scarisbrick Hall when she came. There was a roast meat, and there was bread and beer and fireworks and bands and the procession, and they were generally really pleased to see her. Meanwhile, young Charles, the son of the more eccentric eldest Charles, was brought up in Germany, but he did eventually return to England. He became mayor of Southport, and he built a rather nice house there known as Scarisbrick Lodge. Ultimately, he became Sir Charles Scarisbrick, so considering he was illegitimate, he really didn't do too badly at all, did he? So on that note, perhaps now is a good time to return to our newspapers to look at some other research options. The trouble with illegitimacy is that many people considered it to be something very shameful. It's a moral failing, usually a moral failing on the part of the mother apparently, never mind the father who may have made himself scarce. And of course there are all sorts of circumstances surrounding conception. You don't need to be a genius or indeed a historian to work that one out. You can see there would be all kinds of abuses of power. For instance, an employer might take advantage of their female servant and then sack her when she became pregnant. A young couple might be enjoying a clandestine romance against the wishes of either sets of parents and find themselves presented with unexpected consequences. Or it might even be something a bit more sinister. There's all kinds of reasons. But two circumstances relating to illegitimate births seem to have been considered particularly newsworthy in the 19th century: concealment of birth and affiliation cases. The Ormskirk Advertiser of the 23rd of December 1869 tells us of the case of Mary Elizabeth Johnson. It says that she was convicted of concealment of childbirth at West Derby, near Liverpool, on the 11th of August last. She was strongly recommended to mercy, and having been in prison since August, she was sentenced to 4 days further imprisonment. So Mary Elizabeth Johnson has been in prison for 4 months on the grounds that she has concealed the birth of a child. Now, from that little snippet though, you do get the feeling that the court is quite sympathetic to Mary's case. It doesn't really give any of the details. I'm sure they were heard in court, but it doesn't say that she did anything as dramatic as trying to harm the baby, which did sometimes happen. So maybe she just panicked when she found herself in labour, hid the baby somewhere safe where it would be found quite quickly, and tried to get on with her day as best as she possibly could. You can only imagine the circumstances that she might have found herself in. So now let us look at a report of an affiliation case. Now, when you consider that some of the people buying a regional newspaper probably knew some of the parties involved in these cases, or may have had friends or relatives or employers who were reading and buying this very same newspaper that these names appeared in, you can't help but feel sometimes that the reporters did enjoy offering their readers a little something to gossip about, whether or not that's morally wrong or morally right. Illegitimacy cases seem to have been seen as fair game, just like any other local gossip. So we've got another from the Ormskirk Advertiser from the 8th of August 1867. Anne Baldwin of Burscough summons Henry Prescott for the support of her illegitimate child. The defendant, that is Henry, says, "I want to be married to her and she won't consent." The magistrate's clerk comments, "If the men are willing, it's not often the ladies object." Anne Baldwin, apparently slyly, says, "He only asked me since I summoned him." In other words, he's only asked her to marry him because she's threatening to take him to court, and she did that anyway. An order for 2 shillings and 6pence a week was made, so obviously the court had a little bit of sympathy with Anne Baldwin there, I think. Now really, the entire topic of illegitimacy in your family tree is so huge. It's an enormous topic with many possibilities. And I know I haven't even touched on half of the resources that you could explore. I hope I've pulled out some of the more useful ones, because every case of a child being born outside marriage will be a little bit different. Another source I should mention before I finish up that you might want to look at is the simple possibility that an illegitimate child will be named in a will. Sometimes the father will acknowledge paternity of the child in his last will and testament. One of my relatives, a Joseph Morris from Up Holland, made provision for what he called his natural daughter, there's that phrase again, natural daughter, Anne Green, who's also known as Anne Morris. That's quite interesting, she's got an alias by the look of it. But his relationship with Anne's mother seems to have been very good. They got on very amicably, so amicably in fact that he ended up marrying her. So I think perhaps it was something that was going to happen at some point anyway, and the baby was just born before he was in a position to offer her a good home. I'd like to hope that's what it is. Now, you won't always find a newspaper report for every maintenance case concerning an illegitimate child, and you won't always find enough evidence to be sure who the mysterious father was, although sometimes you get a very useful parish clerk who will make comments, as we've already seen. So it is nevertheless always worth having a good look at these kind of options, because they may not answer all your questions, but they may help you along the way and at least name a name, even if you can't get any further down that line. So thank you for listening to our 3rd virtual talk from Ormskirk District Family History Society, which I hope you have enjoyed, since you cannot come to our meetings at the moment. And if you did enjoy it, or if you've got anything that you would like to add, comment on, then please feel free to leave a comment in the comments box, because we would love to read them, and we do feed them back to the rest of our executive committee. So anything that you want to mention, or indeed if you've got any ideas for other future talks, we would love to hear them, so please feel free. So once again, thanks for listening, hope you enjoyed it.